Welcome, dear listeners. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and at 42 she had lived long enough to see the seasons repeat themselves without surprise. She was born in the small riverside town of St. Bryden in the south of Devonshire, sometime in the waning years of the Victorian age, when steam and soot still ruled the cities but the countryside clung stubbornly to its slower rhythm. Her life had unfolded in the narrow rooms of her husband's bakery, a modest place of wood smoke and flour, where the scent of rising bread was as constant as the ticking of the clock above the hearth. To the villagers she was simply the baker's wife, a dependable figure seen through morning mist, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, her hands forever dusted white. Few knew that beneath her calm industry lived a mind rich with unspoken thoughts and small secret tendernesses, the kind that rarely find a voice, yet quietly keep the world turning. Before we begin, be sure to like, share and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now, lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket, and let's travel together, way, way back together. She woke before the roosters, before the frost on the window could even think of melting, before the baker himself could roll from the warmth of his dreams. It was not love for bread that woke her, though she would lie about that to anyone who asked. No, it was habit, that ancient tyrant of domestic life. Her body, so accustomed to the hour, moved without her consent, pulling her from bed like a puppet tied to the strings of obligation. The boards creaked their old complaints beneath her feet, the same ones they'd whispered since her wedding night 23 years before. The kitchen waited, cold and judgmental. The hearth sulked with yesterday's ashes, and the air carried the faint ghost of yeast, a smell that never truly left, like a memory that refused to fade. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, muttering under her breath about the baker's inability to rise before sunrise, though he somehow expected his wife to be an alarm clock with arms. The flour sack leaned in the corner, plump and smug, knowing full well it held the power to ruin her apron before the day had even begun. As she poured the water and stirred, her mind wandered, as it often did, to the songs she once sang as a girl. They were light things, silly songs about flowers and ribbons and the laughter of youth. She could hardly recall the words now. The years had sifted them from her memory the way she sifted flour, leaving only fragments. Love, morning, sweetheart. Words that now felt like myths, belonging to another person entirely. She hummed a few bars anyway, her voice soft and cracked, like an old window rattling in a winter breeze. The dough didn't seem to mind. She kneaded it slowly, pressing out air and bitterness in equal measure. Each push of her palms was a small act of surrender, each fold a confession she would never speak aloud. Her husband called it artistry, she called it penance. The dough rose obediently under her touch, something in this house finally did. She found that satisfying in a quiet, petty sort of way. The rhythm of kneading calmed her thoughts. It was steady, circular, endless, like the years. The sky beyond the small kitchen window began to blush faintly, embarrassed by its own awakening. She paused for a moment to watch it, her hands white with flour, her hair escaping in dishevelled wisps. Outside, the first sounds of the village stirred, the cough of a farmer, the bark of a dog, the far-off creak of a cartwheel. Soon, the whole place would smell of her labour. They would step into the square and sigh contentedly at the scent of warm bread, never knowing how many small resentments had gone into its making. She smiled at that thought, a small, crooked smile, the kind that lives somewhere between amusement and fatigue. The baker would rise soon, bleary-eyed and proud, and declare to anyone who'd listen that his bread had fed the town once again, and she, as always, would say nothing, brushing flour from her hands, letting him bask in the glory of his loaves. After all, a quiet wife and good bread were worth more than gold, or so he liked to remind her whenever the subject of wages arose. But for now, before the morning truly broke, the kitchen belonged to her. The silence was hers, the heat was hers, even the soft, defiant heartbeat of the rising dough was hers. She pressed her hands against the counter and let the world stay still a little longer. The day ahead would be noisy, filled with orders and laughter and gossip, But this hour before dawn, before she became the baker's wife, she could simply be the girl who once sang about love and mornings and sweethearts before flour dusted her hair like premature snow. The dough was patient as dough often is. It never hurried her, never scolded, never sighed in disappointment. She thought, not for the first time, that if only people behaved more like bread, the world might be a gentler place. Bread didn't talk back or take offense. It only required warmth and time, two things most men seemed incapable of offering. She pressed her fingers into its pale surface, watching it yield and spring back again, forgiving her as it always did. Perhaps that was why she liked it. It was the only thing left in her life that didn't hold grudges. The fire began to stir in the hearth, reluctant at first, then brightening into something that almost resembled cheer. She fed it a few more sticks, murmuring to it as though it were a child. "There now, up you get," she said softly, the same tone she once used when her son was small enough to fit on her hip. He had left 3 winters ago, off to learn carpentry in a neighbouring town. The house had been quieter ever since, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that echoes back at you when you try to fill it. She sometimes imagined his voice drifting in from the doorway, some cheerful nonsense about the day's adventures, but it was only the wind playing tricks on her sentimentality. Her husband claimed she was too soft-hearted, that it made her melancholy. He said it like a diagnosis, as though sorrow were an illness she could cure with more baking. "Keep your hands busy," he'd tell her. "Work chases the sadness out." She had tried that for years, and all it did was chase the sadness into the dough instead, where it puffed up quietly and rose into the air each morning. If the villagers ever wondered why their bread tasted so comforting, she could have told them it was kneaded with equal parts salt, water, and disappointment. She reached for the rolling pin, a faithful old companion, smooth and polished from decades of repetition. Sometimes, when the mornings were particularly still, she would imagine it speaking, not kindly, but with the blunt honesty of inanimate things. "Another day, then?" it might say. "Another sunrise you'll never see for yourself except through the window of duty?" She would ignore it, of course. There was no dignity in arguing with kitchenware, not even for a woman who spent half her life talking to flour. The smell of yeast began to swell in the air, thick and warm, like memory itself. It wrapped around her shoulders and filled the small kitchen until she could almost feel her younger self standing beside her, the girl with quick laughter and flower-free hair, who believed that love was enough to keep a person full. That girl had been terribly naive, but she still lingered, faintly, like the shadow of a candle on a wall long after the flame had died. Sometimes, in that drowsy hour before sunrise, she almost wished she could apologize to her. From the back room came the sound of her husband stirring, a heavy cough, a groan, the familiar shuffle of his slippers. She froze for a moment, hands poised mid-knead, as though caught in some forbidden act. The house always changed once he woke. The quiet, which had been hers, would soon belong to him. His voice, his footsteps, his talk of orders and customers and profits. She resumed her work quickly, shaping the loaves with practiced precision. There was comfort in knowing exactly how much to give. 2 turns, 1 fold, a pinch of salt, a sigh. She thought of how many mornings she had done this, thousands perhaps, each one blending into the next until the years themselves became a kind of dough, endlessly kneaded and reformed but never truly changed. And yet, she told herself, there was something almost sacred in that repetition. The world could spin itself into wars and revolutions, kings could rise and fall, but bread must still be made, and someone must rise to make it. She supposed that was her small claim to immortality, the daily resurrection of something warm and good from the cold stillness of dawn. She lifted the shaped loaves carefully, almost tenderly, and lined them on the wooden peel. Each one looked faintly alive, as though it might sigh if she touched it too roughly. There was a strange dignity in them, plump, trusting things waiting to meet their fate in the fire. She slid them into the oven's mouth, feeling the wave of heat brush her face. For a brief, foolish moment she envied them. They would emerge golden, admired, even loved. She, meanwhile, would emerge from this day much as she always did, dusty, invisible, and half-baked by life itself. The scent began its slow bloom through the kitchen, curling up the chimney and spilling into the quiet street outside. She could almost hear it slipping through cracks and shutters, sneaking beneath doors, stirring the dreams of the villagers. The blacksmith's wife would turn in her bed, sighing at the thought of breakfast. The innkeeper's boy would wake hungry and call for his mother. Even the stray dogs in the alley would lift their noses, reminding the world that hunger was the only thing truly democratic. She often thought the smell of baking bread was the closest thing to kindness a town ever shared. Her husband always said she had a poet's mind and a servant's wage, and though she pretended to take offense, she suspected he was right. She could never simply bake a loaf, she had to think about its meaning. Each crust to her was a sermon, each crumb a confession. Bread is bread, he'd remind her with a laugh, as though simplicity were a virtue, but she knew better. Bread was life pretending to be humble. It was patience disguised as breakfast. She sat for a moment on the small stool near the oven, watching the flames lick their way around the logs. There was something mesmerizing in the motion, an orange dance that seemed almost joyful, utterly unaware that its only purpose was to consume. She thought of that sometimes when she looked at her husband, bustling about the shop with his swollen pride. He too burned brightly, but only so the world could see the smoke and say, "What a fine fire he makes." She, on the other hand, was content to be the quiet ash that kept the warmth steady. The heat grew heavy in the room, pressing against her skin. A fine sheen of sweat gathered on her forehead, catching in the faint lines that had deepened with every passing year. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, smearing a streak of flour across her temple like some weary soldier's mark. She smiled faintly at her reflection in the dull metal pot hanging near the hearth, a ghost of herself, warped and wobbly. "Still here," she whispered to it, half amused, half surprised. When the loaves were ready, the crusts had cracked in delicate golden patterns, like maps of countries that didn't exist. She lifted one from the oven and tapped its underside. It sang that hollow sound she loved, the sound of completion. She lined them neatly on the table to cool, resisting the urge to tear one open. There was no room for indulgence when you baked for others. She sometimes wondered if the villagers would taste the exhaustion she left in the crust, the soft sadness that lived beneath the crunch. Perhaps they did, and mistook it for salt. The first light of dawn crept through the window now, painting the kitchen in pale gold. It was beautiful, she supposed, in a practical sort of way. She didn't have the time or vanity to appreciate sunrises anymore, but she still noticed when they looked particularly honest. She leaned against the counter, hands folded, eyes half closed. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful, the oven cooling, the bread resting, the village not yet awake enough to demand anything from her. She could almost imagine a different life, one where the morning belonged to her alone. But the sound of footsteps upstairs reminded her that imagination, like bread, was a luxury that never lasted long. The floorboards upstairs protested again, long and drawn out, like an old man being forced from a warm bed. She didn't look up. She knew every note of that particular symphony, the groan, the thud, the muttered curse as he stubbed his toe for the 100th time. Her husband was a creature of predictable misfortunes. If he ever managed to get through a morning without dropping something or scolding the cat, she'd have suspected witchcraft. She waited, kneading a final lump of dough for the afternoon batch, her hands moving automatically. It was remarkable, she thought, how much of her life could now be done without thinking. Stir, fold, rise, sigh. She could probably die mid-task, and her hands would go right on kneading out of habit. There was a comfort in that sort of efficiency. It made existence feel less like a choice and more like a very long recipe written by someone she'd never met. He entered with a yawn that could have swallowed the sun. His hair stood in strange directions, like the bristles of a well-used broom. "You've been up again before dawn," he said, as though it were an accusation. She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled faintly. "Bread waits for no man," she said. It was one of those remarks that sounded cheerful if you ignored its quiet despair. He nodded absently, too sleepy to catch the edge in her tone. "Smells good," he mumbled, lifting a loaf from the table and tearing it open without ceremony. The steam curled upward like a spirit escaping the body. She winced inwardly at his carelessness. She'd barely let the crust settle. but then restraint had never been his strong suit. "Perfect as always," he said through a mouthful, crumbs clinging to his beard. She watched him eat, her expression unreadable. There was something oddly satisfying in watching someone devour the thing you've created, especially when you know it's the closest they'll ever come to appreciating you. She wondered how many loaves she'd baked for this man, how many mornings she'd traded her sleep for his livelihood. If there were a heaven, she hoped there would be no ovens in it. Just quiet, and perhaps a soft chair that didn't squeak when you sat down. He poured himself a mug of weak ale and leaned against the counter, surveying her with that vague sense of ownership that husbands seem to develop after a decade of shared air. "You know, the miller says we might raise prices this winter. Wheat's been dear." She gave a non-committal hum. Prices went up every winter, just as tempers did and temperatures fell. The villagers would grumble, but still they'd come, clutching their coins, because bread was never optional. She had learned long ago that survival often depended less on fairness than on appetite. Her husband prattled on about numbers and orders, the sound of his voice merging with the crackle of the cooling oven. She half listened, her mind drifting like flour dust. She thought of her mother, who had been a baker's wife too, and her grandmother before her, all of them up before the sun, hands raw from the same ritual. Maybe there was something noble in that lineage, or maybe it was simply inertia, the kind that passed down like a family heirloom nobody wanted but everyone inherited anyway. He eventually left to fetch firewood, leaving her alone once more. The silence closed in, soft but familiar. She stood still for a long moment, watching the last tendrils of steam fade from the loaves. The kitchen looked almost holy in the pale morning light, flour on the table like snowfall, the bread lined up like offerings. She brushed a hand across the wooden counter and felt a sudden wave of tenderness for the space itself. It had been her prison, yes, but also her chapel. And wasn't that the strange bargain of most women's lives, to find meaning in the very things that confined them? A knock came at the door, a customer already, far too early. She sighed, straightened her apron, and pulled her expression into something that resembled kindness. The day, relentless as ever, had begun. She opened the door to find old Mrs. Hensley already waiting outside, bundled in 3 shawls and a temperament that could curdle cream. The woman's breath fogged in the morning chill, forming clouds that drifted around her like impatient ghosts. "You're late," Mrs. Hensley declared, though the sun had barely cleared the rooftops. "I'm early," the baker's wife replied mildly, which was as close as she ever came to rebellion. She handed over a still warm loaf, its crust crackling softly in protest at the cold air. Mrs. Hensley sniffed it with the solemnity of a priest inspecting relics. "Last week's batch was tougher," she said, as though discussing a personal betrayal. "I'll scold the flour," the baker's wife murmured. "It's grown insolent with age." The old woman gave her a look that suggested she wasn't entirely sure if that was a joke, then shuffled away, muttering blessings or complaints. It was often difficult to tell the difference. She closed the door slowly, letting the latch click back into place. Every customer was a variation on that theme. Hunger wrapped in habit, need disguised as conversation. By mid-morning, the line would stretch down the lane, filled with the same faces she'd been feeding for 20 years, faces that aged predictably, like loaves left too long in the oven. Another knock. This time it was the cooper's apprentice, a boy with a cowlick so determined it could have been blessed by the wind itself. He grinned shyly and held out his coin. "Mum says 2 loaves, please. She says to tell you your bread keeps better than the priest's sermons." That earned the smallest flicker of amusement from her. "Tell your mother that's because I don't knead mine with guilt," she said, and the boy laughed, though he didn't quite understand. She liked him for that. Children laughed for sound's sake, not meaning's. When the door closed again, she leaned against it for a moment, letting her eyes drift over the tidy rows of bread cooling on the counter. They looked so orderly, so obedient. It occurred to her that bread, unlike people, rarely tried to be more than what it was. It never demanded to be praised, never insisted on being special. It was content to be necessary. She wondered if she could say the same of herself. From the street came the hum of the village waking properly now, hooves on cobbles, a woman calling after a child, the first clatter of buckets at the well. The world was stretching, shaking the frost from its bones. She listened for a moment, feeling both within it and apart from it, like a note in a song that no one realized had gone slightly flat. Her husband's voice drifted from the back. He was arranging baskets, humming tunelessly. He had a way of making even cheerful sounds feel utilitarian. "We'll sell out early today," he called. "Good thing you started before dawn." "Yes," she answered softly, though he couldn't hear her over the clatter. "Good thing I started before dawn." She said it again in her mind, tasting the words like a bitter crumb. If she'd started later, she might have had an extra dream, or a moment longer to remember what it felt like not to belong to the oven clock. She began to wrap the loaves in cloth, her fingers deft and practiced. Each one felt like part of herself being parcelled off to the village, her patience to the miller, her humour to the seamstress, her quiet endurance to the schoolteacher who always counted out her coins twice. They'd eat their fill and feel satisfied, never suspecting that what warmed their bellies was the quiet surrender of her mornings. The light through the window had grown brighter now, gold spilling across the flour-dusted table, softening every hard edge. For a moment, it was almost lovely. She paused, her hands stilling on the bread knife, and let herself breathe in the mingled scents of yeast, smoke, and sunlight. It was an ordinary beauty, but it was hers, at least until the next order came through the door. When the last loaf was wrapped and the customer's footsteps had faded down the lane, she finally sat, easing herself onto the wooden stool near the window. The morning was bright now, too bright, spilling across the room as if the sun itself had no sense of restraint. She squinted at it and smiled faintly. The light didn't suit her anymore, it showed too much. Flour in the lines around her mouth, a grey strand or two that had escaped her kerchief. The dullness that had crept into her eyes like fog settling over a field that once caught fire easily. She rested her elbows on the table and stared at her hands. They were broad and steady, a baker's hands. Useful, loyal things that knew the weight of every bowl and the texture of every dough. They looked nothing like the hands she'd once imagined her life would shape. When she was 16, she'd believed her fingers would hold books, or perhaps letters from faraway cities, ink-stained, perfumed, full of possibility. She'd thought herself destined for something delicate, though she could never quite decide what. It didn't matter. Youth rarely requires specifics, only the conviction that something beautiful awaits. She remembered those summers, barefoot in the meadow beyond her father's fields, singing nonsense songs to the bees. There had been a boy once, of course, because there's always a boy in such memories. His name, she realized with some surprise, had blurred around the edges, like ink left too long in the rain. He'd promised to take her to the coast someday, where the air smelled of salt instead of flour, and the waves sang louder than church bells. She had believed him utterly, as only a girl unacquainted with disappointment can. That was before her father fell ill, before the debts came, before practicality married her off to the baker, a man who could feed her, if not exactly nourish her. She didn't blame him, not really. Men of his kind rarely thought beyond the next loaf. It was the way of things. Women kneaded dough, men shaped days. Both grew tired, both rose and fell according to some recipe they'd never agreed to follow. Sometimes she wondered what had become of that younger self, the girl who had wanted to see the sea. Perhaps she was still there somewhere, buried beneath the flour dust and the years, humming softly to herself, waiting to be remembered. But memory was a tricky thing. It liked to play dress-up. Every time she reached for the girl, she found only a woman sitting in a bakery, humming the same tune to different ghosts. She had once thought she might write. That was her secret dream, never spoken aloud. She'd imagined pages filled with her words, observations, little truths about the world that people might nod at while drinking their tea. But life, as it tends to, had handed her other tools, spoons, pans, and responsibility. It wasn't that the dream had died, it had simply been baked into something else, flatter, denser, but still faintly warm if you knew where to touch it. The clock ticked quietly. She glanced toward the oven, still glowing faintly from the morning's work. It struck her how much the fire resembled ambition, bright when young, useful when contained, and dangerous when left unattended. She'd kept hers banked low all these years, steady enough to heat the bread, but never enough to burn down the house. It was, she supposed, a kind of wisdom, or cowardice. The line between the two was as thin as a loaf's crust. A breeze slipped through the window, stirring the flower dust into lazy spirals that caught the sunlight. For a fleeting moment, they looked like tiny galaxies spinning in the air. She watched them drift, her eyes soft, her thoughts quieter now. Perhaps, she mused, that was the real trick of living, not chasing what might have been, but learning to see beauty in what simply is. Still, she couldn't help thinking, if she'd seen the sea even once, maybe the waves would have taught her how to rise without kneading herself first. She rose from the stool eventually, her knees protesting like stubborn old acquaintances who refused to let bygones be bygones. The shop was quiet now, filled with the faint crackle of cooling bread and the occasional whisper of ash settling in the hearth. The stillness felt indulgent, an unauthorized luxury. She took it anyway. There were few things left in her life that hadn't been portioned out or promised to someone else. Her eyes wandered toward the small cabinet tucked in the corner by the window. It was a plain thing, its paint chipped, its hinges crooked. Her husband called it junk storage. She called it memory. Inside were odds and ends collected over the years, buttons that no longer had coats, dried lavender from a summer long gone, a chipped teacup she couldn't bring herself to throw away. It was a museum of unremarkable treasures. She opened it now, the hinges groaning softly, and her fingers moved automatically to the small wooden box on the bottom shelf. The box was nothing special, carved roughly and varnished too heavily, but it had once been the most beautiful thing she owned. She brushed away a layer of flower dust that had settled there, as if time itself had been trying to hide it from her. When she lifted the lid, the faint scent of lavender and old paper rose to meet her, fragile and familiar. Inside were a few folded sheets, brittle at the edges, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. She untied it carefully, the ribbon slipping through her fingers like water. The letters were from that boy, the one with the sea dreams and promises. She hadn't read them in years. She didn't need to. Every line had imprinted itself on her long ago, like handwriting pressed too hard on a page. "When I have my boat," one said, "I'll come for you. You'll see the world from the deck, and your hair will smell of salt." She smiled faintly, almost indulgently, as if humouring a child's fantasy. She remembered how she used to read that line over and over, imagining herself wrapped in wind and waves, far from ovens and flour and the rhythm of kneading. She'd believed him then, not because his words were convincing, but because belief was easier than doubt when you're 17 and certain the world is waiting just for you. She read a few lines aloud now, her voice barely above a whisper. The paper trembled in her hands, or perhaps it was her hands trembling against the paper. The words felt impossibly young. They spoke of futures too large for real life to contain. She wondered what had become of him, the boy with sea in his blood and pockets too empty to buy a future. Maybe he had found the coast, maybe he hadn't. Perhaps he'd married another woman, one who still sang in the mornings, or perhaps he'd simply faded, like dreams do when the oven timer rings. At the bottom of the box lay a small token she'd forgotten about. A seashell, no bigger than her thumb, its pearly edge dulled with age. He'd given it to her one summer evening, saying it was a promise of the sea. She turned it over in her palm now, tracing its faint ridges. It made a soft sound, like the memory of waves. For a moment, the room around her seemed to blur. The flour, the bread, the worn table, all dissolving into that distant place she'd never seen. She imagined herself standing at the edge of the ocean, the wind in her hair, the salt on her lips, her hands empty of dough and full of possibility. It was an image so vivid it almost hurt. Then the door creaked behind her and the world snapped back into its familiar shape. She slipped the letters back into their box, tied the ribbon neatly, and returned it to its place in the cabinet. The seashell, however, she kept in her apron pocket. Some dreams, she decided, were too quiet to bury. She stood for a long while after that, her hand resting lightly over the pocket, feeling the smooth curve through the fabric, like a heartbeat she hadn't listened to in years. Her hand stayed on the pocket for some time, the seashell a small, secret weight against her palm. It was strange how something so light could pull her so deeply into memory. It reminded her somehow of her son, of the years when his small hand used to fit inside hers, just as the shell fit there now. He had been a quiet child, thoughtful in a way that made her both proud and afraid. He used to sit near the hearth while she baked, shaping small figures from leftover scraps of dough, tiny horses, crooked towers, a family of lopsided birds. She'd always let him, even when her husband complained about the waste. "Let the boy make something," she would say. "There's enough dough in the world for both of us." And she'd meant it. She'd wanted him to grow with a sense of wonder, with hands that could build things beyond necessity. But the world, as it turned out, had other plans. When he turned 16, he'd left to apprentice with a carpenter in a neighbouring town. He'd promised to write. He'd even promised to visit every winter, though the winters came and went like reluctant guests, and she had learned not to wait at the window. There had been a few letters at first, stiff and polite, full of assurances that he was well fed and learning quickly, then fewer, and finally none at all. She told herself it was because he was busy, because life had taken him in hand the way it takes everyone. Still, on certain mornings when the mist lay thick over the rooftops, she could almost imagine seeing his figure coming up the lane, taller now, older, but with the same shy smile. She wondered what dreams he carried now, what tools he held in his hands, and whether those hands had grown calloused in the same familiar way hers had. She hoped he had built something of his own, a table, perhaps, or a life less measured by ovens and clocks. A mother's love, she mused, was much like bread itself. It rose even when forgotten, it fed those who'd already left the table, and it never quite stopped being needed, even when no one asked for another slice. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear him humming under his breath while he worked beside her. He used to hum in that tuneless, innocent way children do when they are content, when the world still feels soft and forgiving. She wondered if he still hummed now, or if life, like the baker's oven, had baked that out of him too. Her husband never spoke of the boy much anymore. When he did, it was in the practical terms men favoured. He's probably doing well, or he's got his own life now. Statements meant to close the subject neatly, like tying off a sack of flour. But for her, the thought of him never truly settled. It lingered like a scent in an empty room, sometimes faint, sometimes overwhelming, but always there. She often dreamed, though she would never admit it, that one day he might walk into the bakery again, not as a boy this time, but as a man who understood. He'd see her not as the quiet figure bent over the dough, but as the woman who had given him mornings like this, warm, steady, filled with the smell of something rising. He would tell her, perhaps awkwardly, that he'd missed her bread, and she would laugh, as though that were all it ever took to fill the empty years. The thought made her smile now, a small private smile that creased the corners of her eyes. It wasn't sadness exactly, more a kind of tender ache, like pressing a bruise you've grown fond of. She reached again for the seashell in her pocket and held it up to her ear, listening. It made no sound, of course, but she imagined she could hear both the sea she'd never seen and the sun she'd not heard from in years, each a rhythm she'd once loved, both endlessly repeating just beyond reach. The bakery had settled into that rare, forgiving hush that only arrived between the last customer's footsteps and the first whisper of dusk. The air was thick with the ghost of warmth, the kind that lingers after the fire has done its work but before the chill remembers to return. She stood in the middle of the room, uncertain for a moment of what to do with the quiet. It was an odd thing, to spend her life longing for stillness, only to find it slightly unbearable when it came. She began tidying the counter, not because it needed tidying, but because her hands seemed to require some small choreography to justify their existence. She brushed away the flour in slow, circular motions, watching it rise in soft clouds that caught the slanting light. The particles shimmered as they drifted like tiny constellations suspended in air. She had always liked that, the way something as humble as flour could look like stars, if only for a moment. It made her wonder if the heavens themselves were made of such ordinary dust, only better lit. She leaned against the counter, her elbows resting where the wood had worn smooth over the years. This spot, right here, had been her place, not the hearth, not the table, not even the window, but this small, polished edge where her hands had lived longer than anywhere else. There was comfort in its familiarity, a strange intimacy between skin and surface. If someone had asked her what her life had amounted to, she might have pointed here, to this strip of wood, to the faint indentation her palm had made after decades of mornings. The afternoon light crept across the wall, turning the whitewashed plaster a soft honey colour. It reminded her of old summers, of lying in tall grass with her hair unbound, of the faint hum of bees and the smell of crushed clover. She could see it all so clearly it startled her, the way sunlight had once looked when she had time to notice it. Funny, she thought, how the same sun that once made her feel infinite now only marked the hours until supper. A low sound from the oven, a settling ember perhaps, broke the spell. She turned, half expecting to see movement, half hoping she wouldn't. It was foolish, but she sometimes imagined that the kitchen itself was alive. The oven, a slow-breathing creature. The walls, watchful. The window, an old friend who'd seen everything but never tattled. This room had absorbed her laughter, her exhaustion, her quiet humming when no one else was awake. It knew her better than anyone living did. She looked toward the small stool by the window, her faithful perch in the early hours. It had held her through countless mornings, pregnancies, winters, disappointments. She'd once sat there rocking her son as an infant, her cheek pressed against his soft hair, breathing in the scent of milk and yeast and hope. The stool creaked softly when she brushed her hand over it, as though remembering too. Her reflection caught in the window glass, faint, almost spectral in the dimming light. She studied it without vanity, without sorrow, just curiosity. Her face was a patchwork of years, not unkindly worn but honest. She traced a wrinkle at the corner of her mouth and wondered if it had been carved by laughter or endurance. The two were nearly indistinguishable now. She moved to the table and poured herself a small cup of water, sipping it slowly. The coolness spread through her like a quiet truth. For all the noise of living, the ovens, the chatter, the endless labour, there were still moments like this where the world pressed pause and she could hear the faint hum of her own existence, not the loud kind that demanded applause, but the soft, steady rhythm of a life that had simply continued. She looked once more toward the cabinet where the little wooden box lay hidden away again. "Another day, then," she murmured. The words were half sigh, half prayer. She wasn't sure who they were meant for. The boy who never returned, the man who never left, or herself, standing between the two. Outside, the light dimmed further, the day folding itself quietly into evening. The smell of cooling bread hung in the air, a gentle reminder of what had been accomplished and of what would begin again tomorrow. The light outside had turned the colour of steeped tea, warm, fading, uncertain of its own ending. The bakery sank into a gentler quiet, the kind that arrives when the world itself seems to be holding its breath. She moved through the room without hurry, snuffing out the small lamps near the front counter, leaving only one burning near the window. Its flame quivered with every sigh of the draught, as though it too was deciding whether to stay awake a little longer or give in to the dark. Her husband had gone to the tavern, as he often did when the day's coins were counted. He called it socializing for business. She called it drinking other men's complaints. His absence, though predictable, brought a kind of peace that felt almost indulgent. The house behind the shop was quiet now, its shadows soft and well-behaved. She began her evening ritual without thought. The cooling racks were cleared, the boards wiped down, the ash scooped carefully from the hearth. Each motion was unhurried, methodical, a dance she had learned by heart. There was satisfaction in it, not joy exactly, but the comfort of knowing what came next. Few things in life offered such certainty anymore. Outside, the village was settling too. The muffled sound of laughter drifted faintly from down the lane, where neighbours gathered under lanterns that swung like tired fireflies. A dog barked once, then thought better of it. Somewhere a child was being called indoors. The world, it seemed, was folding itself neatly, tucking away its corners before night took hold. She lit another lamp on the table, its glow spilling across the cooling loaves. The golden light made them look almost alive again, their crusts glinting softly. It always amazed her, in a quiet way, how something so simple, flour, water, fire, could produce such small miracles each day. She supposed the same could be said of her own life. It had been built from the same ingredients, plain beginnings, steady warmth, a touch of labour, a little patience. Nothing remarkable, perhaps, but enough to feed a village. She sat down at last, the stool creaking under her, as if recognising her weight with affection. She rested her elbows on the table and let her eyes drift over the dim room. The air had grown cooler, carrying the faint scent of yeast and wood smoke. The silence pressed close but not unkindly. It was the sort of silence that didn't demand, only accompanied. Her gaze fell on the seashell again, resting on the table beside her cup. She'd taken it from her pocket earlier without realizing it, perhaps wanting it near. The lamplight caught on its faint ridges, throwing small shadows across the wood. She lifted it to her ear again, smiling at her own foolishness. It gave no sound, of course, but in the hush of the bakery she could almost hear it. Waves against a distant shore, the sound of a life not lived but somehow still hers. The flame in the lamp fluttered. She reached out and cupped her hand around it, steadying it with the same instinct she'd once used to soothe her child when he startled in his sleep. There, she murmured, and the flame held. Outside, the last of the daylight bled away, leaving the sky a deep blue-grey. She could see the faint glow of the tavern through the window across the square. Her husband's laughter, carried on the wind, reached her in broken fragments. It didn't bother her. There was no bitterness left, only a quiet understanding that some people found their peace in noise and others in the spaces between it. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. The lamp flickered, the bread cooled, the world slowed. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to be still, not the stillness of exhaustion, but the rare kind that felt like belonging. She thought of her son, of her younger self, of the waves she'd never seen, and though none of them were present somehow in that small pool of golden light, she felt them all around her. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile only earned by surviving quietly. "Tomorrow then," she whispered to the empty room, and the lamp gave a small, approving sigh. The lamps burned lower, their light thinning into soft halos that trembled on the walls. She rose reluctantly, her knees stiff, her shoulders heavy from the day's quiet labours. The house beyond the bakery waited in half-shadow, smelling faintly of wood smoke, yeast, and the faint metallic tang of the cooling oven. It was a lived-in smell, honest, familiar, and faintly sorrowful, like a lullaby hummed out of duty rather than joy. She climbed the narrow stairs, one hand brushing the rail polished smooth by years of repetition. Each step creaked in its own particular voice. She knew them all by heart, the protesting third step, the sulking fifth, the cheerful little chirp of the last one before the landing. The house had its own orchestra of weariness, and tonight it played softly, like a song meant only for her. In their small bedroom the air was cool and dim. The bed waited, unmade since morning, one pillow sunken deep, the other fluffed with unnecessary optimism. She sat at the edge and unpinned her hair, letting it fall in uneven waves over her shoulders. Grey caught the lamplight here and there, but she no longer flinched at it. There was a strange dignity in being weathered, proof perhaps that time had found her worth visiting. She set the seashell on the bedside table, just beside the stub of an old candle. Its pale curve looked almost luminous in the fading glow. She traced it once with her fingertip before blowing out the lamp in the corner, leaving only the candle's hesitant flicker to keep her company. Shadows stretched long across the room, softening everything into gentler shapes. From the street below came the faint sounds of the village settling deeper into night, a cart rattling over cobblestones, a door closing, distant laughter fading into the dark. The world was exhaling. Even the bakery seemed to sigh, the heat of the day finally escaping through the chimney in thin, ghostly wisps. She lay back slowly, the straw mattress shifting beneath her like an old friend making room. The ceiling above was uneven and low. In the lamplight's trembling, she could trace the small cracks in the plaster that spidered outward like pale rivers. She had stared at them countless times, half convinced they were maps of places she'd never seen. Sometimes she imagined one might lead all the way to the coast, a delicate fault line that began here, in this room, and ended in the whisper of waves. The pillow smelled faintly of flour and soap. It was the scent of her life, though she sometimes wished it carried the salt of the sea instead. She turned onto her side, facing the window, where a thin slice of moon hung low like a tired eye. The night outside was gentle, wrapped in that rare stillness that seems to pause even time itself. She thought of her son again, of how he might be ending his own day somewhere under the same moon. Perhaps he was laughing, or working late, or sitting quietly as she was, thinking of her without meaning to. That thought warmed her in an unexpected way. Love, she realized, didn't need proximity. It only needed persistence, and she'd never lacked that. The door downstairs creaked faintly, the unmistakable sound of her husband returning. Boots on the step, a cough, a mutter about the cold. She listened without moving. There was comfort in the predictability of it, in the ordinary noises that filled the house like a familiar song on repeat. He would blow out the shop lamp, lock the door, and shuffle into bed without a word, and she would pretend to be asleep, sparing them both the trouble of small talk. Sure enough, the boards groaned as he climbed the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. The mattress dipped as he lay beside her, the smell of ale mingling faintly with the lingering sweetness of bread. He let out a heavy sigh, the kind that suggested satisfaction more than thought. Within moments, his breathing deepened into sleep. She remained awake a while longer, eyes open, watching the candlelight dance across the wall. The seashell gleamed faintly beside her, a small token of what was and what might have been. She reached for it one last time, pressing it gently into her palm until its edge left a faint mark against her skin. Something real, something hers. The candle flickered, guttered, then steadied again, unwilling just yet to give in to darkness. She smiled at that. She understood the feeling. The candle's flame thinned to a trembling thread, its small light breathing in rhythm with the night itself. The room had grown impossibly still, so still she could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock downstairs, a sound like a distant heartbeat travelling through the bones of the house. It was strange, she thought, how silence was never truly silent. It always carried the weight of small, invisible sounds, a cooling beam, a shifting roof tile, the steady murmur of her husband's sleep beside her. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on the thin wash of moonlight spilling through the window. It traced a pale line across the floorboards and up the foot of the bed, where it lay like a silver thread stitching night to morning. Her thoughts wandered in that gentle, half-floating way that comes before sleep, the borderland where memories loosen their shape and drift like leaves in slow water. She thought of her son first, as she often did when the house was quiet. She pictured him as he had been at 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor by the oven, carving small shapes into scraps of wood while she baked. In her mind, his laughter had no age. It rang bright and new every time she remembered it. She could see the fine curls on his forehead, the small furrow of concentration between his brows. If she closed her eyes, she could almost feel the warmth of him beside her, the way his shoulder used to lean unconsciously against her leg, as though her presence alone could anchor him to the earth. Sleep tugged gently at the edges of her thoughts, softening the corners, blending them into other times. She was younger now, in memory or in dream, she couldn't tell. The air smelled of grass and river water, and the sky above her stretched endlessly blue. The boy from her letters was there, his voice light with promise, the sea glittering somewhere just beyond a hill. She could almost see it now, a shimmer of blue light where the horizon used to end. She laughed, young, unburdened, and the sound startled her even within the dream. The scene wavered like a reflection in rippled glass. The sea receded, replaced by the soft orange glow of an oven's fire. The young man's laughter became the hiss of steam escaping a fresh loaf. The field became her kitchen once more. She was kneading dough, but her hands were small again, smooth, unlined. Each press into the dough released faint music, like waves retreating across sand. She looked down and saw her mother beside her, humming softly, her face both young and old at once. Then the scene folded inward, like paper burned at the edges. Her son was there again, older this time, though his features were half hidden by shadow. He was speaking to her, but she couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, calm and patient, as though he were the one soothing her to sleep. The candle gave a faint pop as its wick surrendered another inch. The sudden sound drew her briefly back toward wakefulness. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy but aware. The room hadn't changed. The same pale line of moonlight crossed the bed. The same quiet weight filled the air. Her husband stirred once beside her, turning over, murmuring something incoherent before falling still again. She looked toward the seashell on the bedside table. It glowed faintly in the dying light, its curve catching the moon as if it held its own small ocean within. She reached for it, her fingers brushing its surface. The coolness grounded her, tethering her to the waking world even as sleep tried to claim her again. She pressed it against her ear one last time, half smiling. The hum inside was nothing and everything, the sound of air, of distance, of time remembering itself. Her breathing slowed. The candle dipped lower. The house exhaled. Somewhere in the walls, the warmth of the day retreated fully, replaced by the deep, cool patience of the night. She hovered between waking and sleep, neither here nor gone, held gently by the rhythm of her own quiet existence. And just before her thoughts dissolved completely, she imagined the faintest whisper of waves, steady and soft, rising and falling in time with her breath. The first light came timidly, as though unsure it was welcome. It crept through the thin curtains and settled in faint lines across the floorboards, touching the wooden chest, the low chair by the window, the small threadbare rug her mother had woven long before she was married. The rug had faded to the colour of old honey now, but she could still remember the day her mother finished it, proud and flushed, saying, "Every home needs something made with love, even if it's only what keeps your feet from the cold." She hadn't thought of that in years. The candle had burned itself down to a small curl of smoke in the night. The seashell still rested on the table beside her, tipped slightly on its side, as though it too had slept. She blinked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the pale morning. Her husband was already gone from the bed. He always rose earlier on market days, grumbling about deliveries and coins. His absence left a shallow warmth on the sheets, quickly fading, like a memory already forgetting itself. She sat up carefully, the bones in her back shifting like a stack of old books being rearranged. The air was cool, touched with the faint scent of baked bread from yesterday's work, and something else. Salt, maybe. Or her imagination pretending the sea had found its way here overnight. She inhaled deeply and smiled at the thought. It wasn't real, of course, but the illusion was kind enough to let her believe it for a moment. Beside the window, her apron hung neatly from its peg, freshly washed and stiff from drying by the hearth. She had mended it 2 nights ago by lamplight, adding a small patch near the hem, an old scrap of blue cloth left over from her son's childhood blanket. The sight of it made her chest ache in that slow, dull way that no longer hurt but never fully healed either. She traced the edge of the patch with her fingers before tying the apron around her waist, the same motion she'd made nearly every morning for 23 years. Downstairs, the bakery waited in its usual half-darkness. She lit the small oil lamp near the hearth, the flames sputtering awake with a hiss. Dust motes stirred in the air, golden in the thin morning light that leaked through the shutters. The oven loomed cold and silent, its mouth black and waiting. She could almost hear her husband's voice from the market square already, boasting about their loaves, his laughter roughened by the morning chill. He'd return in an hour, hungry and proud, expecting the fire to be lit and the dough ready. As she reached for the kindling, her eyes fell on something tucked behind the flour sack, a small wooden horse crudely carved and missing one leg. She paused, smiling faintly as she brushed the flour dust from it. It was one of her son's old creations, from when he used to play at her feet, insisting that his little army of dough and wood could march across the kitchen table. She turned it over in her hands. A faint line of childish initials was scratched into its side. T.H. Thomas Hayes. The sight filled her with a warmth that startled her in its clarity. She had forgotten she'd kept it. She set the horse on the windowsill beside the lamp. It looked oddly at home there, watching the dawn arrive with her. Perhaps, she thought, it had waited all these years to see the light again. She smiled at that notion, childish perhaps, but better company than most conversation she'd had in months. She began to stir the flour into a bowl, the familiar rhythm easing her body into motion, the soft scrape of wood against clay, the gentle swirl of water meeting powder. It was the music of her mornings. As she worked, she found herself humming, faintly at first, then louder. It was an old tune, one of those nonsense songs from her youth that had survived only in fragments. The words had long since disappeared, but the melody still remembered her, carrying itself across the years with quiet loyalty. The sound of her own humming made her laugh, softly and without reason. She hadn't laughed in the morning for a long time, not the polite chuckle she used for customers, but something unpracticed and honest. It startled the cat that had wandered in from the alley. The small creature blinked at her, thin and grey, a scavenger that visited often enough to consider itself family. She bent down and placed a small crust of bread from last night on the floor, watching as it approached cautiously. The oven crackled to life again. The flame took hold, shy at first, then steady, casting the same orange glow that had greeted her the morning before, and 1,000 mornings before that. She looked into it for a long time, feeling that strange, reverent pull the sight always gave her. Each new fire felt like both a beginning and a repetition, a reminder that the day's miracles were often the same ones disguised as routine. She wiped her hands on her apron, turned to the window, and watched as the village beyond began to wake. The faint silhouettes of rooftops glowed under a sky not yet blue, and from somewhere down the lane the sound of a rooster announced what she already knew. It was time to begin again. But she didn't move just yet. She stood there quietly, the morning light soft on her face, one hand resting on the table, the seashell still in her pocket, the little wooden horse keeping watch from the sill. And for a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, she felt as though the day was waiting for her, not the other way around. The first knock came just as the sun broke free of the horizon, pale and uncommitted. It was not the brisk rap of a customer, but the heavy, uneven pounding she knew too well, her husband returning from the market, boots muddied, voice ready to fill the quiet she had so carefully tended. She brushed her hands on her apron and opened the door before he could wake the whole street. He entered with the damp chill of morning clinging to his coat. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his breath a mix of air and ale. "Good trade today," he said, his words already thick with pride. "Sold everything before the clock struck 8. They know our bread's the best in the parish." She smiled, small and polite, as she always did. "That's good," she said. And it was, though not for the reasons he thought. The better the trade, the sooner he'd return to boasting elsewhere, leaving her again to the peace of her work. She took the sack from his hand and began unpacking it. Inside were a few coins, a twist of coarse salt, and, to her surprise, a small bundle of apples, scarred and irregular, but bright with colour. "Thought you'd make those tarts you used to," he said, shrugging off his coat. "The ones with spice." She paused for a moment, fingers still resting on the fruit. It had been years since she'd baked anything, just for taste, for pleasure. The memory of those tarts came back to her in sudden, startling detail. The scent of cinnamon, the laughter of her son waiting by the window, the crisp flake of the crust breaking under his small, eager hands. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I might." He grunted, satisfied, and moved to the back to stoke the fire. The sounds of his motions filled the room, metal scraping, logs settling, the faint whistle of air through the chimney. She moved around him wordlessly, setting aside the apples on the counter. It struck her how easily their movements fit together, two people bound by rhythm rather than affection. Years of shared habit had made them partners in choreography, if not in heart. Outside, the lane had come alive. Through the open shutters, she could hear the calls of the fishmonger, the laughter of children chasing a stray goose, the steady clip of hooves from a passing cart, the smell of wet earth mixed with the faint sweetness of morning bread. She wiped her hands on her apron again and watched as sunlight began to pool in the doorway, spilling warmth across the flour-dusted floor. For the first time in many mornings, she found herself wanting to step outside, not far, just to the stoop, to feel the sun without the filter of glass or obligation. She hesitated only a moment before pushing open the door. The air met her softly, cool, but forgiving. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the light. The village square shimmered faintly under a veil of dew, rooftops glistening, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. It was the same view she had seen every day for 2 decades, and yet it looked almost unfamiliar now, touched with something new she couldn't quite name. Her husband's voice called from behind her, some question about flour, or timing, or nothing at all. She turned back, answering absently, still half lost in the brightness. In her apron pocket, the seashell warmed against her palm, its curve pressing gently into her skin, as though reminding her it was there. She rubbed it once, unconsciously, and thought, not sadly, but with a kind of gentle curiosity, how peculiar it was that the sea she'd never seen had still managed to follow her everywhere. A child's laughter echoed from the lane. 2 girls ran past, their skirts catching the morning light like lanterns. One of them held a scrap of bread, torn unevenly, still steaming. "Mama says it's the baker's wife who makes the soft kind," one shouted to the other, grinning before they disappeared around the corner. She stood very still at that, the words hanging in the air longer than they had any right to. Then she smiled, a quiet, honest thing, and stepped back inside, the warmth of the shop wrapping around her once more. The oven glowed, the dough waited. The day had begun again. As she took up the wooden bowl and began to knead, her hands fell easily into rhythm. She realized she was humming again, softly at first, then stronger, a sound that filled the little bakery the way the smell of bread filled the village, steadily, faithfully, without asking permission. And for that brief stretch of morning, the world, her small, ordinary, flour-dusted world, felt almost whole. By mid-morning, the village was fully awake. The street outside pulsed with life, the clip of hooves, the calls of merchants, the laughter of children pretending to work while doing anything but. Through the open window drifted the mixed perfume of living, hay and smoke, damp wool and frying fat, someone's perfume worn too generously, someone else's temper fraying before noon. She took it all in like weather, unavoidable, uninvited, strangely reassuring. Inside, the bakery glowed with the golden kind of warmth that only bread can conjure. Loaves lined the shelves like quiet soldiers waiting to be chosen. The new batch in the oven swelled obediently, soft and full, their crusts already blushing from the heat. She watched them through the small iron grate, her hands resting on the counter. It was, she thought, the only kind of magic she'd ever truly mastered, transforming raw, stubborn ingredients into something that fed strangers, and on rare mornings like this one, soothed her too. Her husband had gone again, off to barter with the miller or argue with the butcher, whatever occupied his pride for the day. She preferred it that way. The shop breathed better in his absence. The air itself seemed to stretch. She moved slower, more deliberately, tasting the rhythm of the morning as though it were a secret only she was allowed to know. On the small wooden shelf above the counter sat her mother's clock, still ticking though one hand had long since gone missing. Its sound filled the room with a kind of steady reassurance, marking time in polite ignorance of its own inaccuracy. She'd kept meaning to fix it, but there was comfort in its uneven rhythm. Life rarely kept perfect time either. She found herself thinking, as she worked, of her mother's kitchen, the smell of soap and onions, the low murmur of her parents' voices drifting in from the yard. Her mother had been a woman of impossible patience, never hurried, never hopeful, content with the simple satisfaction of completing a task well. At the time, it had infuriated her. Now she found it almost enviable. She wondered when resignation had stopped sounding like defeat and started sounding like peace. The bell above the door jingled faintly. A customer. A young woman entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a scarf looped twice around her neck. She couldn't have been more than 20. "Morning, Mistress Hayes," she said, smiling shyly. "2 loaves, please." "The same as yesterday." "Morning," the baker's wife replied, wrapping the bread carefully in paper. The girl's hands, she noticed, were unlined, pink at the knuckles, soft as dough itself. She had the look of someone whose troubles hadn't yet learned her name. "A fine morning for baking," she added gently, handing over the parcel. "Oh, I wish I could bake," the girl said, laughing lightly. "I'd burn water, I would. My husband says I could spoil the weather if I tried." The baker's wife smiled at that, but something inside her softened. She remembered being that young, speaking her husband's name with that same mixture of pride and disbelief, as if love were an accomplishment rather than an accident of timing. "Don't learn too fast," she said, almost to herself. "The world will teach you soon enough." The girl blinked, uncertain whether she'd heard right, then thanked her and left, the bell chiming her exit. The baker's wife watched the door for a moment after it closed. The sunlight caught the girl's hair as she crossed the street, and for a second it seemed to glow like a candle still in its first hour. She hoped sincerely that it would burn longer than hers had. She turned back to the oven, pulled the loaves free, and let the scent fill the room. Steam rose, curling around her wrists like breath. She placed the bread on the cooling rack, listening to the quiet crackle of crust meeting air. It was a small, perfect sound, one she never tired of. It reminded her that creation, no matter how ordinary, still carried a trace of divinity. From outside came the sound of a church bell striking 10. She wiped her hands, removed her apron, and poured a small cup of tea from the kettle by the hearth. The tea was weak, but warm enough to count as comfort. She sipped slowly, leaning on the counter, eyes half closed. The morning had moved past its rush now, settling into the long, slow stretch toward afternoon. In the quiet, she caught herself humming again, though she hadn't meant to. The same half-forgotten tune from her girlhood, the same one that used to drift out the window on summer mornings. She realized, with a small, wry smile, that even forgotten songs have excellent memories. By early afternoon, the light had softened into something warmer, slower, the kind of light that made even the dust in the air look deliberate. The bustle from the morning market had quieted. Only the occasional cart rolled past, its wooden wheels sighing over the stones. She left the bakery door propped open to let in the faint breeze, carrying with it the faint sweetness of pears from the grocer's stall 2 doors down. It mingled with the smell of bread in a way that made her stomach remember hunger, though she hadn't felt true hunger in years. She took a seat by the window, a small wooden chair she'd claimed years ago as her own. The chair had a slight wobble on one leg, which she'd long since learned to rock with instead of fixing. Her husband would have mended it long ago, but she never mentioned it. The unevenness had become its charm. She rested her elbows on the table and watched the world outside, the miller's apprentice sweeping the doorstep, a dog chasing the same patch of sunlight it never seemed to catch, the blacksmith's daughter walking with a basket of eggs she held as if they were pearls. On the far edge of the street, a woman was hanging laundry on a line, the white sheets snapping in the wind. The sight stirred a memory, her own linens long ago, stretched across the yard when her son was small. He used to run between them, laughing, hiding behind the cloth as if the world disappeared when he did. She could still remember the scent of those days. Soap, milk, the faint sweetness of clean sun-warmed fabric. There had been laughter then, not loud, but constant enough to live in the walls. The sound of footsteps pulled her from the memory. A young boy stood in the doorway, barefoot and shy, holding a coin wrapped in cloth. "Mum says 1 loaf, please, missus," he said, not quite looking her in the eye. His voice trembled the way small voices do when sent on important errands. "Of course," she said, smiling gently. She wrapped a loaf for him, slipping a small heel of yesterday's bread into the bundle as well. "Tell your mother it's from the end of the batch. Can't sell the last slice now, can I?" The boy looked up then, surprised, his grin missing 2 front teeth. "Thank you, missus," he said, clutching the bread like treasure before darting out again into the bright afternoon. She watched him go, the cloth bundle swinging from his hand, and felt a sudden wave of tenderness that came from nowhere in particular. She rose to tidy the counter, but her eyes lingered on the shelf where the small wooden horse stood. Its single missing leg made it lean ever so slightly, as though preparing to move but unsure of the direction. She wondered, not for the first time, whether her son still carved things, tables, chairs, perhaps even toys for someone else's child. The thought was bittersweet, but not unkind. Love, she had learned, could live perfectly well inside longing. It simply grew quieter there. The bell of the church struck once more in the distance, a deep, slow tone that filled the air and faded as softly as it came. She poured herself another cup of tea, this time adding a small slice of apple for sweetness. The fruit bobbed gently on the surface, spinning lazily. She had never cared for sugar, but this small compromise, felt almost luxurious. Her husband would return soon, bringing his noise and his tired pride with him, and the peace would shift back into its usual shape. She didn't resent it. Theirs was a life of shared silences and shared tasks, a long conversation that had lost the need for words. But for now, in this golden slice of the afternoon, she belonged only to herself. She leaned back, let her hands rest on the tabletop, and closed her eyes for a moment. The warmth from the window touched her cheek. The scent of fresh bread still lingered, and from somewhere in the distance came the hum of a woman's voice singing a tune she half recognized. It might have been her own once. It might have been her mother's. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when you realize you've carried something so long it's become a part of you. The bread would rise again tomorrow, the same as always. But for this quiet hour, she felt, without needing to explain it to anyone, quietly, exquisitely alive. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted into its quieter voice, that golden, slanting kind of light that flattened the rooftops and made everything look a little older, a little more forgiving. The day was exhaling again. The bakery's warmth had thinned. The scent of bread, once thick and possessive, now hung faintly, like a memory reluctant to leave. She opened the front door wider to let in the cooler air, and the hinges, weary from repetition, sighed as if sharing her thoughts. The lane outside was calmer now. Most of the villagers had retreated indoors, shutters half closed, their chatter replaced by the clink of dishes and the muffled rhythm of evening chores. A stray chicken pecked near the stoop, unhurried, while a cart creaked past, carrying bundles of straw that smelled faintly of sun and sweat. Even the cobblestones seemed to have grown drowsy, their edges softened by the amber light. Inside, she began wiping down the tables again, though they didn't need it. Her hands simply didn't know how to be still. She ran the cloth in slow circles, the grain of the wood catching faintly beneath her fingers. Each knot and scratch had its own small story, the scorch from an overfilled tray, the notch where her son once dropped a knife, the pale patch where her husband had spilled ale and never properly cleaned it. She touched each one lightly, the way one touches old scars, acknowledging without reopening. From somewhere in the back room came a faint sound, a drip of water from the roof beam where the last rain had found a flaw. It had started 2 weeks ago, no worse than a single drop now and then, but she'd grown oddly fond of it. The rhythm had become familiar, a quiet counterpoint to her thoughts. It reminded her of a heartbeat, one belonging to the house itself, patient and uncomplaining. She lit the small lantern that hung by the window, its glass still cloudy from last winter's smoke. The flame caught, trembling at first, then steadied into a soft, warm glow. The light brushed against the wooden horse on the sill, making its crooked shadow stretch long across the table. She smiled faintly. It looked almost alive now, galloping across the tabletop as the lantern swayed with the breeze. Outside, the church bell rang 6 times, each chime rolling through the air like slow ripples over water. She had lived by that sound for more than half her life. It was how she measured the day, not in hours, but in echoes. Every bell marked not just time passed, but time endured. She poured herself another cup of tea, this one darker, stronger. Her husband would be home soon, and she would need her patience reheated, so to speak. He would want to talk about the price of grain, about how the blacksmith's wife was underbaking her rolls again, about the miller's gossip and who'd borrowed from whom. He'd speak as though his words carried the importance of scripture, and she would nod in all the right places. She'd learned long ago that listening was the only labor that left no visible fatigue. Her gaze drifted toward the window again, where the light was dimming into that peculiar blue-grey that precedes twilight. A boy was walking up the lane with a basket of fish, calling out his wares in a voice already hoarse from use. A woman followed behind, sweeping her doorstep with more determination than success. The air smelled faintly of smoke now, mixed with the tang of river water carried in from the docks. She found herself thinking about the sea again. It always came to her in the evening, as if the dying light reminded her of it, the great horizon she had never seen but somehow missed all the same. She imagined what the shore might smell like, sound like, feel like under her bare feet. She wondered if her son had ever gone there. Perhaps he had stood on a pier one morning, holding a piece of bread she'd baked years before, and thought of her without knowing why. The thought made her chest tighten, not painfully, but the way a string pulls gently against a knot. She placed her cup down and rested her chin in her hands, watching the last line of sunlight fade from the floor. The bakery grew dimmer, softer, its corners blurring into shadow. There was peace in that dimness, an agreement between light and dark that neither would overstay its welcome. Her husband's voice reached her before his figure did, echoing faintly from the lane, a booming call to someone, a laugh, the scrape of boots on stone. She didn't move to greet him yet. She stayed where she was, in the hush between day and night, feeling the gentle weight of her quiet kingdom settle around her once more. The drip from the roof beam sounded again, steady, certain, endless. She smiled at it, thinking that even the smallest things learn to endure, drop by drop, day by day. Her husband entered with his usual fanfare of ordinary noise, boot scraping against the floor, door slamming too hard, a long exhale that seemed to claim the room as his by right. He carried the cold with him, that damp evening chill that clung to wool and skin. "Smells good in here," he said, not looking at her yet, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Folk were saying our bread's softer than anyone's this side of the river. Told them it's the water, secrets in the well." She smiled faintly, setting 2 bowls on the table. "It's not the water," she murmured, more to herself than to him. But she didn't correct him aloud. Let the world believe softness came from a well. Truth was too small a luxury to waste on pride. He sat heavily at the table, stretching his legs with a groan that seemed rehearsed. "Long day," he said, as though she hadn't lived through one of her own. His hands were rough, dusted with flour at the edges of his nails, his knuckles pink from cold air and work. He was not unkind, just steady in that way men became when habit had replaced tenderness. He looked at her briefly, the sort of look one gives to a clock to confirm it's still ticking. "You've not eaten yet?" "Not hungry," she said simply, setting a small loaf and a wedge of cheese before him. He tore the bread in half with the same impatience he gave to every meal, chewing as though time itself might be waiting for him to finish. The candlelight caught in the lines of his face, softening the edges she had memorized long ago. He spoke between bites, recounting bits of gossip from the market, the cooper's new apprentice, the mayor's wife and her spoiled dog, the rising price of eggs. She nodded when appropriate, her thoughts drifting freely in the pauses between his words. His voice became the sound of background life, like the ticking of the clock or the whisper of the oven cooling. She'd once thought of these talks as dull. Now she found their predictability soothing. You could live a long life among familiar sentences. The lamp on the table flickered, its wick burning low. She reached to trim it, her hands steady despite the tremor of the flame. The gesture drew his eye for the first time that evening. "You've got flour on your cheek," he said, half smiling. She touched her face, finding the faint powder near her jaw. "I suppose I always do." "You always did," he agreed, and for a heartbeat there was warmth in his tone. A flicker of the man he'd once been, when laughter came easily, when they'd stayed up late talking about everything and nothing, long before the bakery owned them both. It passed quickly, as such moments do, but she caught it and tucked it away like a crumb saved for later. He poured himself a cup of ale and leaned back with a sigh, his gaze drifting toward the window. The village outside had gone dark, save for a few distant lanterns glowing like watchful eyes. "Rain coming," he muttered. She followed his gaze. The clouds had thickened indeed, their edges faintly silvered by the moonlight struggling behind them. "We could use it," she said. The air already smelled faintly of iron and wet leaves, the earth preparing itself for what it knew was inevitable. He finished his meal in silence, then stood, muttering something about checking the shutters. She watched him move through the small rooms, his steps heavy, certain. The familiarity of it all settled around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she'd been cold without. When he returned, she had lit the second lamp. The 2 flames danced together, small but determined, filling the bakery with a honey-coloured glow. He sank back into his chair, stretching his arms with a yawn that seemed to echo through the years. She poured herself a small cup of water and sat across from him. The silence between them was not awkward, only old. She had come to think of it as another living thing in the room, dependable, aging alongside them both. Outside, the wind began its slow rise, nudging the shutters and whispering against the doorframe. She reached into her apron pocket and felt the seashell again, cool and familiar against her fingertips. The sound of rain had not yet begun, but she could imagine it, the steady, soothing rhythm that would soon fill the night. She turned the shell over in her palm and smiled faintly. "I used to love the sound of storms," she said softly, almost without meaning to. Her husband looked up, surprised by the sudden intimacy of the thought. "You still do," he said after a moment. "You just don't say it as much." She met his eyes then, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. The lamp flickered between them, its flame small but unyielding. Outside, a single drop of rain struck the window, trailing downward like a sigh. The rain began hesitantly, as though testing its welcome. A few drops first, soft and uncertain, tapping the window like fingers asking permission. Then came the rhythm, the slow, deliberate kind that settles in for the night. The sound filled the spaces between their breaths, weaving itself through the warmth of the bakery until even silence felt soaked through. She loved this kind of rain, the steady, thoughtful kind that didn't rush its arrival. It muffled the world into gentleness, made every noise smaller and somehow kinder. She sat back in her chair, letting the sound sink into her bones, and thought, not for the first time, that rain had a way of washing the hours clean, even the weary ones, especially those. Her husband said something about closing the back door, but his voice was already fading beneath the soft percussion of water on the roof. He rose, muttering, and she watched his figure move in and out of the lamp's glow. The rain darkened his shoulders when he opened the door a crack, then quickly shut it again, shaking his head with a small laugh. "Coming down proper now," he said, toweling his hair. She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the window where raindrops gathered and raced each other down the glass. One particularly large drop caught the reflection of the lamp flame, making it look for a fleeting second like the world outside was full of tiny, wandering lights. It reminded her of the stories she used to tell her son, that the rain was full of travelers from the stars, visiting Earth for a single night before drifting away again. He'd believed her for years. Perhaps she still believed it herself. Her husband settled again across from her, boots off, his feet stretched toward the oven's cooling warmth. "That roof will need patching before winter," he said absently. "It always does," she answered, though her mind was elsewhere, drifting along the sound of the rain as if it were carrying her somewhere she'd forgotten how to go. The smell of wet earth slipped in through the cracks of the shutters, mixing with the faint sweetness of bread. It made her think of mornings after storms, when the sky still smelled of metal and promise. The drip from the roof beam had found its rhythm again, now joined by the rain's deeper hum. Together they made a strange duet, two different kinds of persistence playing in time. She imagined, for no clear reason, that the world itself must sound like this when listened to from far away, steady, quiet, enduring. Her husband yawned and rubbed his eyes. "We'll need to wake earlier tomorrow," he said. "Festival crowd'll be in by sunrise." He rose, stretched, and gave her shoulder a gentle pat, more habit than affection, but not unkind. "Don't stay up too long," she nodded. "I'll be up soon." When he left the room, the air seemed to expand again, filling with the whispering rain and the faint hiss of the dying lamps. She stood slowly, stretching her back, and crossed to the window. The lane outside was silver with water, puddles collecting where the cobblestones dipped. Across the way, a single lantern flickered in the cooper's shop, its light bending and trembling in the wet. Everything looked softer in rain, as if the world itself had chosen to forgive. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, closing her eyes. The sound was endless. Drops striking wood, trickling along the eaves, pooling beneath the shutters. It was like listening to the earth breathe. She wondered if her son could hear it too, wherever he was. Maybe the same storm wandered over his town, tapping at his window, reminding him of the house where it always rained just like this. The thought made her chest ache in that gentle, bearable way she had come to know so well. She turned from the window and moved toward the lamp, lowering the wick until the light dimmed to a small, steady glow. The rain went on, tireless and unbothered, drumming softly against the world. She sat back down, hands folded, eyes half closed, listening, and as the sound filled her, she realized, quietly, without surprise, that she was not lonely, only awake. The rain showed no sign of tiring. It had settled into a steady rhythm now, a low, continuous murmur that seemed older than the house itself, the kind of rain that forgets it ever began and expects never to end. Upstairs, her husband's footsteps thudded across the floorboards, followed by the groan of the bed as it accepted his weight. Then the soft, uneven breaths of sleep began, those familiar sounds that had accompanied her for half her life. She waited until they deepened, until the rhythm of his rest matched that of the falling rain. The bakery below was dim and golden, lit only by the last surviving lamp. She had moved it to the counter, where its weak glow spilled across the wooden boards, turning everything it touched into shades of amber and shadow. The fire in the oven had long gone out, leaving only faint warmth radiating from its bricks. It was that hour of night that felt neither alive nor dead, when even the walls seemed to be listening, but to nothing in particular. She poured herself a small cup of water and drank slowly, savouring the quiet. The glass felt cool in her hand. The air itself had grown heavy, full of damp sweetness from the rain-soaked earth outside. The smell of yeast still lingered faintly, threaded through everything. She could never quite tell whether she liked that scent or hated it. It was her life distilled into air, comforting, ordinary, and inescapable. Her gaze fell on the little wooden horse again, still perched on the sill by the window. The lamplight made it shine in places, and for a moment it seemed to bow its head toward her, as though acknowledging the hour. She rose and picked it up, running her thumb along its uneven surface. The grain of the wood had grown smooth over the years, its missing leg no longer sharp but rounded by time and dust. It felt like her, unfinished, but softened by use. She set it down beside the seashell, the two small keepsakes catching the same dim light. The sea and the stable, two lives she had never lived, sitting side by side on her counter. She laughed quietly at the sight, not mockingly but tenderly, as though the world had finally made a small joke meant only for her. She sank onto her stool, elbows resting on the table, chin propped in her hands. The lamp flame wavered slightly in the draught, painting her reflection on the window pane, a faint double of herself, half shadow, half light. The woman in the glass looked back with tired eyes, but not sad ones. There was a certain steadiness there now, a peace that had not come from ease but from endurance. For a time she simply listened, to the rain, to the faint creak of the rafters, to the clock's uneven heartbeat upstairs. The night had a strange fullness to it, as though the world had been reduced to its simplest elements: water, wood, breath, and memory. It was enough. Her thoughts drifted to the boy she had raised and the man he must have become. She wondered if he had ever stayed awake through a storm like this, not because he couldn't sleep, but because the sound was too beautiful to waste. Perhaps he sat somewhere at a workbench, running his hands over the grain of new wood, thinking vaguely of the smell of baking bread he could no longer place. Perhaps he'd even carved something small, a toy, a trinket, and wondered, without knowing why, who it might remind him of. The lamp hissed softly as its oil ran low, a quiet reminder that the night was thinning. She leaned forward and turned down the wick until only a thin blue flame remained. In that half-dark, everything seemed closer. The walls, the rain, her own thoughts. She could feel the pulse of the world under her fingertips, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient that had let her borrow one more day. She rested her head on her folded arms, eyes still open, listening to the house breathe. The bakery had cooled completely now. The warmth that remained was hers alone, drawn inward, quiet and private. The smell of bread had faded into something fainter, like memory, like the echo of song after the voice is gone. The rain went on. She stayed there, unmoving, as if she might outlast it just by being still enough. The edge of night was soft and shapeless. The lamp had burned itself almost to nothing, and the rain had quieted into the steady whisper that comes only when the storm has made its peace with the world. The bakery lay in half-dark, that tender grey in which the familiar forgets to show its outlines. She rested her cheek on the crook of her arm, eyes half open, letting drowsiness slide over her like a shawl pulled from the shoulders of sleep itself. Her thoughts, loosened by fatigue, wandered without permission. The sound of the rain became the sound of kneading, water folding through dough, hands pressing and releasing. Each droplet struck the roof like a heartbeat she remembered from long ago, her child's, fluttering against her chest when she'd first carried him home through another storm. She could almost feel that small weight again, the smell of his hair tangled with milk and ash and warmth. The bakery blurred. She was somewhere else now, in her father's field maybe, or a memory pretending to be one. The grass was high, wet with rain, and the sky had that strange silver edge that comes just before dawn. She was running, barefoot, skirts clinging to her knees, a loaf wrapped in cloth pressed to her chest. Someone was calling her name behind her, laughter carried over the wind. She turned, certain she'd see her younger self chasing, but there was no one, only the sea spread out before her, endless and breathing. She didn't remember walking to it, but there it was. Waves rolled in slow, deliberate arcs, grey and glassy, each one folding itself neatly into the next. She felt no fear. The wind tasted faintly of yeast and salt. She knelt, set the loaf down on the sand, and watched it steam as though it had just left the oven. A child's hand, her son's, impossibly small again, reached out to take it. He smiled up at her, his mouth moving, but his voice was the rain, gentle and far away. Her head jerked slightly. The stool creaked. For a moment she wasn't sure which world she occupied. The faint glow of the lamp reclaimed her, pulling her back into the dim, flower-dusted room. Her heart beat slowly, but with a kind of relief, as though she had just returned from a long journey she hadn't meant to take. The seashell gleamed faintly beside her hand. She picked it up, still half in dream, and held it to her ear. The sound inside was the same as always, soft, circular, infinite. But tonight it felt less like the sea and more like breathing. Her own, the house's, the world's. A quiet promise that nothing had ended. Not really, it had only changed its rhythm. She placed the shell back down, closed her eyes again, and let her weight sink forward until her arms folded into a makeshift pillow. The rain outside continued its patient hymn, and she floated just above sleep, caught between the woman she was, the girl she'd been, and the sea she had almost seen. The rain stopped as quietly as it had begun. It left behind a strange kind of silence, the deep, resonant stillness that comes only after the world has finished saying something important. The air smelled newly washed, sharp with wet stone and wood smoke. Somewhere outside a rooster tried his luck too early, his call cracked and uncertain, as though even he was surprised to find the night had loosened its hold. She stirred slowly, the way a leaf might turn in the wind. Her cheek had pressed a faint print of flour onto her sleeve, and her neck ached from sleeping folded over the table. For a long moment she didn't move. The stillness was too precious to break. Her eyes opened halfway, adjusting to the pale, uncertain light that was beginning to filter through the shutters, an early, ghostly grey that made everything look suspended between shadow and shape. The lamp had burned out sometime in the small hours, leaving only a thin trail of smoke dried into the air. The seashell caught the first thin ribbon of dawn and gleamed softly beside the wooden horse. They looked almost conspiratorial, sitting there together, as though they had kept watch over her through the long rain. She smiled at them both, two quiet witnesses, two fragments of everything she had loved and lost, side by side in the morning's first light. The bakery itself had changed in the night. It was cooler now, the oven cold to the touch, the air faintly damp. She could smell the rain's footprint on the floorboards, the faint sweetness of yeast mingling with clean air. It was, she thought, like waking inside a memory, familiar yet gently rearranged. She rose, joints whispering their protest, and crossed to the window. The shutters gave way with a soft groan. Outside, the lane glistened, silver-edged and empty. Water pooled in the dips between stones, reflecting the dim sky like hundreds of small mirrors. A single bird hopped along the gutter, pecking idly at the puddles. The world felt tender, raw in its freshness, as though everything had been remade overnight and was still unsure how to move again. She drew a slow breath, tasting the morning. It had a cool bite, clean, metallic, alive. For the first time in weeks, she felt the smallest flicker of something that might have been joy or something quieter still, acknowledgement. The day had returned as it always did, but it had brought with it the faintest shimmer of difference, the kind one can only notice after a storm. Her husband's footsteps echoed faintly overhead. He was up before the sun today, humming tunelessly, his usual gruffness softened by the weather's hush. She smiled to herself, reaching for her apron. The motion was automatic, but the feeling beneath it was not. The cloth was still faintly warm from where she had hung it near the oven the night before. She tied it around her waist, pausing for a heartbeat before lighting the first lamp of the new day. The flame caught quickly, its light spilling across the counter, reclaiming the room from its shadows. She touched the wooden horse once, then the seashell, her fingers leaving faint traces of flour behind. Morning, she whispered to them both, and to herself, as if the three of them were sharing the secret of survival. Then, with practiced ease, she began to gather the bowls and flour, her movements sure and unhurried. Outside, the world was still half asleep, but inside the bakery, life was beginning again, softly, steadily, as it always did, rising out of darkness into light. The grey at the windows paled to a shy gold. The rain's aftertaste still lingered on the air, cool and sweet, like water poured over iron. She heard her husband's slow tread on the stairs, each step familiar, as predictable as the ticking of the old clock. He appeared in the doorway still half-buttoned, rubbing sleep from his face. "Already at it?" he asked, his voice thick with the first words of the day. She nodded, her hands deep in flour. "The dough waits for no one," she said. It came out lightly, almost teasing, though both of them knew it was true. He grinned, faint and crooked, the ghost of his younger self passing across his features. "You and that bread," he muttered fondly, moving to stoke the oven. Sparks answered him, small gold stars leaping up into the morning air before vanishing. New sounds joined them as the village roused itself, doors unlatching, a broom sweeping a step, a horse snorting against the chill. From somewhere near the square came the soft ring of a church bell, testing its voice. The rhythm of the world slipped neatly back into place, worn and familiar as an old shoe. Yet beneath it, she felt the faint, tremulous freshness that follows a night washed clean, something fragile, almost invisible, like a breath drawn before the day begins in earnest. Her husband moved about the room with a kind of easy purpose, humming under his breath. She realized with mild surprise that the tune was the same one she'd hummed herself the night before. It made her smile, though she didn't say anything. Some melodies travelled quietly from one soul to another, unnoticed but understood. She worked the dough in steady rhythms, the soft slap and fold of it filling the silence between them. Every few minutes he would pass behind her, brushing close, handing her a bowl, checking the fire. The nearness was simple, wordless, a comfort that asked nothing of her but existence. The air between them felt different today, thinner maybe, lighter. It wasn't peace, not exactly, more like truce made gentle by time. A knock came at the door before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. The miller's boy stood there, wet hair sticking up at odd angles, holding a small sack of fresh grain. "Da says it's the finest grind this week," he announced proudly, his bare toes curling against the damp stone. She thanked him, pressed a still warm heel of bread into his hand, and watched his grin light up the doorway before he disappeared back down the lane. The first customers of the day would follow soon, and she could already imagine them. The same faces, the same coins, the same small pleasantries exchanged as though time itself had no other language. Yet the idea didn't weary her this morning. It felt almost like a privilege, to begin again, to be needed in small, ordinary ways. She dusted her palms and looked toward the window. A beam of sunlight had found its way through the thinning clouds, striking the wet cobblestones until they glittered like scattered glass. Her husband noticed it too. "Looks like fair weather after all," he said. "Maybe it'll hold," she answered, though she didn't really mind if it didn't. There was comfort even in the promise of more rain, in the thought of the world continuing its endless wash and rinse. She turned back to her dough, pressing her palms into it once more, and the warmth of the oven behind her made her shoulders relax. The smell of yeast began to bloom again, soft and hopeful, curling through the air the way the first light curled across the floor. The village outside was stirring, stretching, shaking off the remnants of night, and within that quiet pulse of beginning she found herself humming again, just above a whisper, keeping time with the world as it woke. By the time the church bell struck 8, morning had fully claimed the street. Light poured through the bakery window, Real light now, clean and decisive, gilding the flour dust that hung in the air like the remnants of a dream. The room smelled alive again, yeast, smoke, and the faint sweetness of baked crust. The warmth crept back into the walls, and her hands, settling there as though it had never left. The door creaked open and the first of the regulars appeared, shaking off the damp with a kind of practiced cheer. Old Mrs. Hensley again, punctual as weather. "Morning to you," she announced, inspecting the shelves as if they might misbehave. "You kept the good crust, I hope." "I always do," the baker's wife said, passing her a loaf still breathing steam. The woman pressed a coin into her palm and, as always, offered a scrap of gossip in exchange. Today it was about the innkeeper's niece and a soldier rumoured to have smiled at her twice. The baker's wife listened with the faintest trace of amusement, the story fading behind her as soon as the door closed again. Each customer brought their own small wether. The cooper's apprentice came next, face flushed from running, and she slipped him a biscuit no one would miss. A fisherman followed, smelling of salt and metal, leaving behind damp footprints shaped like half-moons. Then the schoolteacher, neat and distracted, counting her coins twice and thanking her 3 times. The morning filled itself with these tiny exchanges, brief, unremarkable, yet somehow sustaining. Her husband busied himself at the back, stacking trays, muttering to himself about ledgers and deliveries. His voice blended with the creak of shelves and the clatter of tools, all of it part of the familiar orchestra of day. The noise used to press against her like a weight. Today it felt softer, as though the night's rain had wrung the sharpness out of everything. Between customers, she took a moment to wipe the counter and glance toward the window. Outside, the puddles were already shrinking in the sun. The lane gleamed in places where the water lingered, and a small cat, perhaps the same one from the other morning, sat in a beam of light, tail curled neatly around its feet. She smiled, half expecting it to look up at her, half certain it already knew she was watching. She caught her reflection in the glass again, pale from the early light, eyes soft with fatigue, and something gentler than fatigue. Behind her, the wooden horse and the seashell kept their quiet vigil on the sill, glowing faintly in the brightness. The sight of them steadied her. She touched her apron pocket where the patch of blue cloth rested, and for a heartbeat she thought she smelled apples and spice, the ghost of a tart still waiting to be made. A breeze pushed through the door as another customer entered, carrying with it the scents of the street. Wet leaves, horsehair, the faint perfume of someone's breakfast cooking down the lane. "Morning, Mistress Hayes," the woman said, smiling. "Smells like heaven in here." "Just bread," she replied, handing over a loaf, though she knew it wasn't quite true. There was something else in the air this morning, something quieter and newer, though she couldn't name it. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it was simply herself, noticing it at last. The bell above the door jingled again, and soon the counter was busy. The loaves left in quick succession, each one disappearing into someone's hands, their warmth carried out into the day. Her palms, still dusted with flour, moved without thought, but her heart felt oddly awake, as if each exchange left behind a faint trace of connection, thin but real, like threads invisible in sunlight. By mid-morning, the shelves were nearly bare, and she paused, leaning on the counter, listening to the hum of life outside. The village was alive again, the day properly begun, the world repeating itself exactly as it should. And yet, somewhere deep in the quiet rhythm of it all, she felt something different stirring, small but certain, like dough beginning to rise. By late morning, the bakery had emptied itself of chatter. The last loaf went to a young mother balancing a baby on her hip, and when the door closed behind her, the quiet came rushing back, gentle and grateful. The light was stronger now, brighter than it had been in weeks, pouring through the window in long, deliberate beams that painted everything gold. The wooden horse gleamed where it stood, the seashell glowing faintly beside it like a small captured moon. She wiped her palms on her apron and looked around. The shelves, bare now, looked oddly proud of themselves, as though emptiness were a kind of accomplishment. The smell of baking still lingered in the air, warm, soft, filling the corners like invisible music. She left the door propped open to let the morning breeze wander through, bringing with it the murmur of the street, wheels on cobblestone, someone laughing, the faint echo of a hammer from the blacksmith's shop. Her husband had gone again, off to fetch flour from the mill. He had left with a familiar clatter, boots, muttered lists, a quick tug at the latch, and she had watched him go with the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd have the place to herself for an hour. She hung her apron on its peg and stepped out onto the stoop, blinking in the sunlight. The street was drying fast. Puddles shrank into silver coins, catching the last of the morning light before vanishing into the cracks. The air still smelled faintly of rain, threaded now with the sweetness of freshly cut hay from somewhere nearby. Across the square, children were rolling a hoop along the stones, their laughter skipping ahead of them like thrown pebbles. The sound reached her softly, like a song half remembered. She leaned against the doorframe, hands folded, and let the warmth of the sun press gently against her face. It felt like permission to stand still, to do nothing, to simply be. She couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed herself that luxury. The world had always demanded motion, production, purpose. But here, in this small spill of sunlight, she found a different kind of work, the quiet labour of noticing. A cart rattled past, pulled by a brown mare with a patch of white on its nose. The driver tipped his hat to her, and she nodded back, a small exchange of civility that felt like its own kind of prayer. Behind him came a group of women carrying baskets of herbs to market, their chatter bright and easy. One of them, Margaret, the butcher's wife, called out, "Your bread was perfect this morning, as always." The baker's wife smiled. "It behaves better than people," she called back, and the women laughed as they passed. The sound lingered pleasantly, like spice in the air. She sat down on the low step, her skirts pooling around her, and rested her elbows on her knees. From here she could see the rooftops glinting under the sun, their damp tiles sparkling like 100 small mirrors reflecting the day back at itself. A swallow darted overhead, its wings slicing quick patterns through the air. For a moment she imagined she could feel its motion in her own chest, a small, swift lifting, a heartbeat lighter than her own. She thought of her son again, as she always did when the world felt too gentle not to share. She wondered if he was working this morning, if the scent of wood shavings clung to him the way flour clung to her. Perhaps he too stepped outside sometimes, just to feel the light on his face, not realizing that somewhere someone else was doing the same. The thought comforted her. Love, she decided, did not vanish. It simply changed its shape and waited to be recognized. The church bell struck noon, its sound deep and mellow, rolling through the square like a reminder that the world was still keeping time. She stood slowly, brushing flour from her skirts that wasn't really there, and turned back toward the bakery. The sunlight followed her across the threshold, spilling over the counter, warming the tools of her trade. The air inside felt different now, brighter, lighter, touched with the faint promise of rest. She placed her hand on the counter, on the same smooth patch of wood her palm had worn down over the years. The warmth of the sun lingered there. Outside, the laughter of the children had faded, replaced by the hush of the midday lull. Inside, the silence waited for her to move again, but not urgently. It was patient, companionable. She smiled softly to herself, almost without knowing why, and stood there a moment longer, listening, breathing, existing exactly where she was, as the new day stretched open around her. The light continued to climb, brushing gently across the walls until every shadow seemed to retreat in good manners. Eleanor let her hand trail along the counter, feeling the faint warmth the sun had left there. Outside, the village moved at its own careful pace, boots striking cobblestones, a cart creaking past, the far-off clang of the blacksmith's hammer announcing another day of labour. It was the same rhythm she'd known for years, yet she never quite tired of it. There was comfort in knowing how the world would sound each morning, as though life itself were an old song that needed only to be remembered. She crossed to the window and opened it wider, letting the air roll in. The scent of wet earth still lingered from last night's rain, mingling with the faint sweetness of yeast that clung to the room. For a moment, she thought she could hear the river beyond the fields, the quiet rush of water moving somewhere she couldn't see. It reminded her of time itself, flowing steady and patient, carving its mark through everything it touched, herself included. On the sill, the little wooden horse and the seashell caught the sunlight together. She smiled faintly at the sight, reaching out to straighten them both. "You two behaved today," she murmured, half amused by her own tenderness. The horse leaned a little, its missing leg giving it the same tired poise she felt in her own bones. The shell gleamed softly, pale as morning milk. She touched it once, then left it there, letting the light find its curve. She turned back toward the quiet bakery, its emptiness no longer lonely, but alive with possibility. There were loaves to prepare, pastry to fold, orders to fill, and yet, beneath it all, something lighter stirred, a soft hum of gratitude that she couldn't quite name. The world, freshly washed by the storm, seemed to ask nothing of her but what she already knew how to give. She breathed in the morning once more and smiled to herself, steady and unhurried, before reaching for her apron. She tied her apron with practiced ease, smoothing the creases as though the simple gesture could bring order to more than just fabric. The bakery felt different in this light. Familiar, yes, but softened, as if it had drawn a long breath and decided to forgive everything it held. She began to gather her tools, the worn wooden bowl, the scoop of flour, the jug of water cool from the well. Each thing greeted her hand like an old friend, ready to resume its part in the small ceremony that bound her to each new day. As she worked, her mind wandered the way it always did when her hands were busy. She thought about how much of life was like baking, how everything depended on warmth and patience, how too much of either could ruin the whole. She thought of her mother's voice, steady and low, reminding her that bread doesn't rise by being watched, only by being trusted. The memory made her smile. Trust, she supposed, had carried her through more years than luck ever had. A shaft of sunlight cut across the counter, catching the dust motes in its path. They spun lazily, suspended in air, and for a heartbeat she felt as though the world itself had paused just for her. The rhythm of kneading took hold, her movements steady and sure, the dough yielding under her palms with quiet grace. It rose slowly, obedient to her touch, and in that small act she felt the universe align, simple, whole, complete. She lifted her head at the sound of a bell somewhere down the lane, its tone clear and bright. Morning mass, perhaps, or simply another hour announcing itself. She wiped her hands, looked around the room, and let out a long, contented breath. There was nothing grand waiting beyond these walls, but somehow that was enough. The day had already begun to rise, and she, like the bread, was part of its unfolding. The hours unfolded slowly, as if they too wished to linger in the light. Eleanor moved through the bakery with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime learning the quiet choreography of her own labor. The oven began to glow again, a soft orange heartbeat at the center of the room, and she could feel its warmth against her back as she worked. Each loaf she shaped felt like an offering to the day, small, humble, but honest. The scent of baking bread drifted through the open door, curling into the street like a summons, and she could hear it being answered in the distance, the faint laughter of children, the murmur of footsteps drawing nearer, the rhythm of life returning to its daily script. She paused once, brushing flour from her cheek, and caught sight of herself in the window, her reflection softened by the sunlight, a woman neither young nor old, but perfectly placed between what had been and what still might be. There was something comforting in that realization, a rare contentment that came not from change but from acceptance. She thought, as she turned the loaves and wiped her hands, that her life was like this bread, a quiet thing, rising again and again, not because it must, but because it knows how. Outside, the bell in the church tower struck the quarter hour, its sound drifting lazily over the rooftops. She smiled to herself and continued her work, her movements sure, unhurried, belonging entirely to the moment. And as the morning light deepened into gold, Eleanor Hayes felt her world settle once more into its gentle, well-worn rhythm, steady, simple, and perfectly enough. By midday, the village had found its full stride, and the steady hum of life reached her through the open door like the low murmur of a familiar tune. Eleanor paused for a moment in her work, leaning one hip against the counter, a wooden spoon still in her hand. The sunlight had shifted again, pooling near her feet and turning the flour dust in the air into a gentle, swirling gold. She could hear the baker's bell ringing faintly across the lane, calling the last of the morning's customers, and beyond that, the rhythmic clatter of cartwheels echoing through the square. She took comfort in these sounds, the small proofs that the world continued to turn even when no one was watching. Her husband's voice carried from the back room, humming a tune without words, and for once it didn't irritate her. Instead, it folded easily into the day's music, the scrape of the peel against the oven floor, the creak of the door hinges, the sigh of loaves cooling on the rack. Everything worked in quiet conversation, and she realized with a faint, amused tenderness that she had come to love this language, the daily dialogue of ordinary things. As she stood there, the scent of bread filled the air again, richer now, layered with the sweetness of butter warming on the shelf and the faint trace of wood smoke from the neighboring chimney. She felt something inside her, something small and still, shift gently like a bird turning in its sleep. It wasn't joy exactly, nor nostalgia, but a calm, wordless understanding that this was her life, and it was good. The simplicity of it no longer pressed on her like confinement. It opened quietly, like a field after rain. She closed her eyes for a moment, just breathing, letting the warmth of the oven and the golden hum of the village fold around her until she could no longer tell where her own heartbeat ended and the rhythm of the day began. As the sun leaned westward, the light in the bakery mellowed to a honeyed hue, wrapping itself around the wooden shelves and the slow, curling steam that rose from the last of the loaves. The rush of the morning had faded into something gentler now, a hush broken only by the faint clink of the cooling tins and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Eleanor moved through the calm with the unthinking grace of routine, gathering crumbs, straightening jars, brushing flour from her skirt. Outside, the world had slowed too, the carts gone, the chatter dimmed, even the river's murmur sounded half asleep. She stood in the doorway for a while, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched the stillness spread through the lane. The air smelled faintly of grass warming under the sun and the distant sweetness of honeysuckle. A swallow darted low across the street, its wings cutting the light, and for a moment her breath caught at the beauty of it. Brief, unannounced, utterly unnecessary, and therefore perfect. She thought of how many days she must have lived like this, folded neatly between dawn and dusk, her existence unremarkable and yet complete. Perhaps, she mused, the world didn't need grand gestures to make it turn, only steady hands, quiet hearts, and the patience to rise again after every night. She touched the doorframe lightly, feeling the grain of the wood worn smooth beneath her fingertips, and smiled to herself. Inside, the bakery waited for her, the seashell and the wooden horse still keeping their watch on the windowsill, the air still warm and sweet with what she had made. And in that soft, suspended moment before the light began to fade, Eleanor Hayes felt the deep, unspoken truth of her life settle over her like sunlight, that she had already found, without ever seeking, everything she would ever need. The afternoon light lingered longer than usual, reluctant to surrender to the coming dusk. Eleanor moved through the slow, golden hours with an unhurried ease, her mind wandering as freely as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She had begun peeling apples for tarts, each curl of skin falling in delicate spirals that collected at her feet like red ribbons. The rhythm of her knife against the board was steady, meditative, the same rhythm she had once used to soothe her son when he was restless as a child, tracing circles on his back until his small shoulders stilled. She wondered where he might be now, whether he still carried any trace of her in his habits, the way he stirred his tea, the way he listened before he spoke. Perhaps he had children of his own, small hands that tugged at his apron strings, small voices asking questions about things too simple for answers. The thought brought a soft ache that didn't sting so much as hum, like an old song remembered half true. She laid the slices neatly in their tin and sprinkled them with sugar and spice, the scent rising sweet and sharp into the air. It filled the bakery with something that felt almost like memory made visible. Outside, the sun had shifted to the western windows, its light now long and slanting, cutting the room into bars of gold and shadow. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the perfume of apples and warmth, and thought how strange it was that an ordinary day, one that looked like every other, could feel suddenly weightless, as if life itself had exhaled and left her floating, suspended between what had been and what quietly awaited. By the time she set the tarts on the sill to cool, the light had begun to tilt toward evening. The sun no longer poured in, but brushed lightly at the window panes, turning everything it touched to amber. Outside, the air had taken on that faint chill that hinted of nightfall, the kind that slipped beneath the door quietly, respectfully, as though not wanting to startle the warmth inside. The sounds of the village had changed, too. The hammering and chatter of the day gave way to softer noises, the distant laughter of children being called indoors, the bark of a dog echoing across the square, the low, rhythmic splash of water as someone scrubbed steps before supper. Eleanor stood in the doorway again, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched as smoke began to rise from chimneys all around her, slow and blue against the fading light. The scent of it mingled with her own: apples, sugar, bread, and together they formed a fragrance that belonged entirely to the hour between work and rest. For a while she simply listened, her eyes following the shadows as they stretched long across the cobblestones. The church bell rang once in the distance, a deep, solitary note that seemed less a call than a benediction. She thought of how each sound, each scent, each slant of light marked time, not in minutes, but in seasons of living, the same patterns repeating, yet never exactly the same. In the doorway of her bakery, with the warmth of the oven still at her back and the first cool breath of evening on her face, Eleanor Hayes felt herself balanced delicately between the two, neither bound to the past nor hurrying toward tomorrow, simply resting within the grace of the present moment as the sky deepened into a soft, forgiving blue. When the sky finally surrendered its color, Eleanor began her slow closing ritual, the same one she had performed nearly every evening for half her life. She moved through the bakery by lamplight now, her shadow following her across the flour-dusted floor like a patient companion. The air had cooled, settling into that perfect hush between day and night, when even the walls seemed to breathe more slowly. She trimmed the wick of the nearest lamp, steadying the flame with her hand until it burned clean and small. Its light brushed the curve of the wooden horse and caught in the sheen of the seashell beside it, making them glow as if they remembered some secret from the sea. She smiled faintly, murmuring a soft good night to them both, an old habit she no longer questioned. The scent of baked apples still lingered, rich and comforting, mingling with the faint tang of smoke from the hearth. Outside, the village had grown dim, the windows across the square glowing like embers against the dark. She could hear the faint murmur of voices drifting through the cool air. Neighbors talking low, a door closing, footsteps on wet stone. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, but full, as if the whole world were exhaling at once. She leaned her hand against the counter, the wood smooth beneath her palm, and felt the deep contentment that came only at the end of an honest day. Nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet, somehow, everything had. The bread had risen, the rain had fallen, the world had turned once more. She stood there for a long moment, eyes half closed, letting the warmth from the oven fade from her skin until all that remained was the calm pulse of her own heartbeat and the soft whisper of evening settling gently around her. As the afternoon light thinned, the warmth inside the bakery softened to a hush. The air shimmered faintly, heavy with the last breath of heat from the oven. Outside, the sounds of the village had fallen into that sleepy quiet that always came after the noon meal. No carts, no laughter, only the whisper of wind tracing along the cobblestones. She finished sweeping the flour from the floor and hung her apron neatly by the door. The shop looked content now, empty shelves, cooling trays, a faint glint of sunlight resting on the counter. Everything seemed to be waiting, though for what she could not say. She paused by the window, her hands folded lightly before her, and let her gaze drift out across the street. The puddles from the morning storm had disappeared completely, leaving the stones clean and pale as bone. Her husband sat dozing in his chair near the hearth, his head tilted slightly forward, his mouth parted just enough to hum the rhythm of sleep. She watched him for a moment, feeling neither affection nor resentment, only familiarity, that tender cousin of love. The sight comforted her in its ordinariness. There was something steady about a man at rest, the kind of steadiness one could build a lifetime around without meaning to. She crossed the room quietly and touched the little wooden horse on the sill, setting it upright where it had tilted. Beside it, the seashell gleamed faintly in the fading light. She lifted it once more and held it to her ear. The sound inside was as soft as breath, as endless as memory. For a moment she imagined she heard her son's laughter folded within it, distant, salt-edged, alive. She smiled, her eyes closing. The day outside was dimming into that golden hour that comes before dusk, where everything glows as though remembering how to be kind. The village would soon wake again for the evening, doors opening, voices rising, but for now the world was resting. She breathed it in, slow and deep, the smell of rain-washed air and bread and peace. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, dough to knead, fire to feed, faces to greet. The sameness no longer felt like weight, but like a rhythm, a song she had finally learned to hum in harmony with. She touched the seashell once more before setting it down, its curve catching the last of the sunlight like a promise kept. Then she turned down the lamp, its flame bowing low in quiet obedience. The room settled into twilight. The sound of her husband's breathing blended with the soft creak of the settling boards. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not the press of another day ending, but the calm, steady grace of one simply fulfilled. The baker's wife closed her eyes and listened as the evening gathered around her, warm and familiar as rising bread. The world exhaled. She exhaled with it, and the house, faithful as ever, held her in its gentle, flower-scented hush. And so, as the evening deepened over St. Bryden, the small bakery kept its gentle watch, a warm, flickering heart at the centre of an ordinary town, where Eleanor Hayes, the baker's wife, lived her days as steadily as the turning of the bread she baked, her life rising and falling in perfect, tender rhythm with the dawn.